Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are here to honor Chris Chandler, to give her our love, our respect, our goodbyes. And to begin, let's just take a moment to reflect on Chris, on who she was to us: sister, friend, wife, dearest colleague. Take a moment, go inside yourself, see her inside yourself, and let yourself embrace her while we're quiet now. Chris was one of the most beautiful women I think I've ever met. And today we have a number of people who felt likewise about her. we are going to have a number of people who loved her, knew her, different aspects of her, different facets of the jewel that she was. Each person will be speaking just for a few minutes about the Chris that they loved. Then in the middle of our speaking, we'll have some music, a little bit more music, because Chris was a lover of music, as is Jim. Then a few more speakers. And at the end, we will ask each of you to speak to the neighbor next to you, if you wish, about Chris, your thoughts about Chris, just for a few minutes. Or if you wish also, you can simply remain in silence, thinking about her. And at the end, if anyone wishes to volunteer to come up to speak about Chris, we welcome you. After that, we will have a little bit more music as we leave, and then go to the parish hall for food, for gathering, for connection, as the community that loved her remembers her, and embracing of each other in our coming together to honor her. So let's begin with Michael Morrison.
First of all, on behalf of Jim and Chrissy's extended family, thank you so much for being here. It warms our hearts that she has so many close friends that touched her life and that whose lives she touched. Chrissy was the third, she was the youngest of three daughters, the Chandler daughters. And I think because of that, sorry you can't hear back there? Because of her youth, she excelled academically and in her career. Hopefully somebody else will speak to that. But I'm just here to tell you three stories that were close to my heart. When Chrissy was just in high school, I was dating her middle sister, Nancy, and I was invited to come stay with the Chandlers in Tulsa, Oklahoma during spring break. Actually, I think it was Christmas vacation. And one night I was out with some friends that I had met and got home so late that the lights were out, the doors were locked. And of course, wanting to leave a lasting impressions on Mr. and Mrs. Chandler, I didn't want to ring the doorbell and have them come down and see me after having a few too many beers. So I thought it would be smart to start throwing pebbles at the bedroom window upstairs, thinking it was Nancy's. Chrissy opened the window and came to my rescue. She directed me to the wall, to the roof, and in the window. I gave her a big hug and knew we'd be close friends to the end of our lives. A few years later, Nancy and I married. We were living in San Francisco, and Chrissy's father thought that he would help her buy her first car, which was a friend of mine owned a Volkswagen dealership, so Bill got a really good deal, of course. But she wound up with a cute little red Volkswagen Bug. Unfortunately, it was stick shift, and Chrissy didn't know how to drive a stick shift. So I volunteered. I found the flattest parking lot that I could find. And, it was pop the clutch, stall the engine, pop the clutch, stall the engine. We did this for an hour or two until she could get from point A to point B, all the gears, including reverse. I think we even practiced parallel parking. But I told her it wasn't over yet. She had to master the hills of San Francisco. Now, Chrissy was a talented tennis player as a junior in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So she had good hand-eye coordination. But left hand on the steering wheel, left foot on the clutch, right foot on the gas and the brake, and right hand on the emergency brake, parked at an angle like this. To go up the hill without sliding back and hitting the car behind you takes a lot of coordination. And after quite a long time, she mastered that as well. I think that clutch probably was the shortest lived clutch in any Volkswagen. Years later, I was practicing architecture. I was working for an architectural firm in San Francisco. Nancy was working for Marsh McLennan down in Montgomery Street in the city. We bought our first house in Sausalito. And at that time, Chrissy was actually living with us for a month or two, maybe more. One night, she had a boyfriend come to visit, flying in from San Francisco late at night. And it was so late that Nancy and I went to bed. And Chrissy went off to the airport to pick up her friend. We woke up, coughing, smoke in the house. Go out into the hallway, out into the balcony, and the room was filled with smoke. I had this house was a modified A-frame with a gambrel roof, a huge 2-story expansive wood wall that I had decorated with Marimekko prints. And Chrissy, wanting to impress her incoming boyfriend, had set candles. She loved candlelight, low light. She set up candles. Of course, that caught the Marimekko on fire. And but it wasn't hot enough to burn the house down. She got home and she was crying and distraught. And I thought, any girl that cared so much about a boy that she'd stage a room like that was I just couldn't get mad at her at all. So she was loyal friend, she was determined, and she had a touch of romanticism as well. My thoughts on immortality. After we leave this life, someone reads your name, sees your picture, remembers you, or tells a story about you. In my mind, that's immortality. So please remember Chrissy well and remember her often.
Mark Connell will speak next.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Jim's brother, his youngest brother. And on behalf of our family, our other brother, Mike Connell, my wife, his wife, and our children, we thank you all for coming here today. Mike is right now on his way to Hungary to visit his daughter. And we know that Chris would have told Mike, go see your daughter. But he has sent his wishes and his blessings. And I have the responsibility of speaking for him too. So I'll try to do my best. Following this Michael is kind of tough. When thinking about Chris, you have to realize I first met her after she was already under the influence of my brother. So I questioned her judgment from the outset. Only to learn that she was a very independent young lady. We spent the most time with Jim and Chris when they lived in Philadelphia. At that time, my wife and I and family had moved from California back to New Jersey. So we encountered each other as often as we could because geographically that's the closest we ever got to each other. When thinking about Chris, I can't help but think about some literary aspects. And please don't judge Chris by the literary novels I mentioned, but Bonfire of the Vanities comes to mind. Not for the reasons you may think, but in that book, the prosecutor is described as a very gung-ho young man. And his problem with his father was that when he was young, they would travel up to Pikes Peak, and he resented his father because his father always said, "You don't need to go to the top, just go halfway, the view's the same." And when I think of Chris didn't go halfway. She wanted the top of the mountain. And in movies, I think of The Devil Wears Prada with Chris. Again, not for the reason you may think. But there's a portion in the movie where Meryl Streep is describing the importance of high fashion, and that it's not just this high fashion elitist. That's going to be what you're wearing in about a couple years, because it leads the way and it shows you the way. And Chris would show us the way. She was demanding. She didn't only want the best. She wanted you to want the best. And if you didn't, you had to explain why. And that's not always a good thing. One of the times we'd go over to Jim's house, and there was always a schedule when we got there. And we had to watch a movie. Chris insisted on watching this movie, and she was so excited about it. And like Michael pointed out, the scene was always set, the lights were dark and just right, the movie was on, and we'd sit down, and the four of us, my wife Jan and I, Jim and Chris, and it was the worst movie ever. It was god-awful. But the movie would end, and Chris would uncurl herself from Jim and knock a cat off and everything, and get up on a cushion and get right in front of you and look at you with her glasses and her seriousness and goes, "Wasn't that great? What did you think?" And you'd have to look at her and go, "It was great." So she's left that with us. And that in life, I know I compromise all the time. But when I think of Chris, she makes me want to do better. And she makes me demand more things. And I think she's done that to everyone she's touched. So for that, I want to thank Chris. And thank you, guys.
Ellen Skinner will speak next.
When I was thinking about Chrissy, I thought she has so many different names. There's Dr. Cristine Chandler, the brilliant developmental psychologist. There's Chris, the dear friend. And then there's Chrissy, the sister and the beloved wife. Cristine was a strong and caring woman. And everywhere she went, she found other strong and caring women to befriend. And she went after them with a determination that would curl your hair if she got you in her sights, if you were lucky enough to be gotten in her sights. And I have the honor today of reading a few remembrances from those closest to her. We really had a flood of remembrances from the women that she was really close to in the different places that Jim and Chris lived. And so we edited them down a little bit. But I just want to read a few paragraphs from each one so that you get a sense of the reach of her friendships. The first is from Judith Wool. So she starts. "Hi, Chris. I know you're here, right here. Your spirit fills this room so strongly, I can almost see you. I can hear your laughter. Your presence is palpable to us. You have to be there, because so many people who loved you are gathered here. This room is full of love for you. Not only Jim and your many friends from Orcas, but your beloved Nancy and her family and so many others. Jane and I are here in spirit too. We couldn't fly out to be in this room, but we're still here. I can hear the creaks in the floorboards, the buzz of the conversation, all of the tears, and the calming breezes of your beautiful island, Orcas. What a gorgeous place. You wanted to build your dream house here, and you did. You built a home that is as comfortable and cozy as it is expansive and stunning. And slowly and surreptitiously you filled it with cat after cat. You wanted to create a community of support and caring for you and Jim, and you did. You wanted to enjoy the realization of so many years of preparation and vision, and you did. You wanted your friends to share that manifestation of your dream, and we did. We all did. And then you died here. None of us were ready for that, Chris. None of us wanted to lose you so soon, or lose you at all. We still can't believe that you're gone. How can you be gone when you're still here with us in this room? Your presence was such a joy. You read more novels than anyone north of San Francisco, and your insights were always interesting. You were funny and so generous. Whatever you had, you shared with those you loved. I feel blessed to have been your friend. We had so many good times. Philadelphia, Monhegan Island, Orcas, Scottsdale. Ironically, the first time I met you, we walked the full length of the West River Drive to Philadelphia Art Museum to raise money for breast cancer. I had never met anyone who walked so fast. If you've ever tried to keep up with Chris, you can relate to that. And who was so well-versed on so many subjects. On Monhegan, Jane and I did most of the hiking while you and Jim admired the artwork and became friends with some of the artists whose work you purchased. In case I never told you, Chris, I always admired your taste and your ability to see beauty in the world around you. What I loved the best about our times together was watching the intimacy of your friendship with Jane, how the two of you shared so much with profound honesty. You and Jane were such dear friends. I've lost not only you, but that relationship as well. I loved you, Chris. May your memory be a blessing. I also got a note, Jim and I got a note from Chrissy's best friend from Rochester, Joanne Pedro Carroll. My heart goes out to Joanne because the reason she couldn't come is because another dear friend of hers, Kathy, is dying of cancer right now, and she wanted Joanne near her. So Kathy is the name of Joanne's friend, and Joanne writes, Kathy is sleeping peacefully, and so I'm able to use this time to write about Chris. I'm so glad I have this opportunity, but I'm also deeply sorry I can't be there in person to honor my dear friend. I first met Chris when I was still a graduate student at University of Rochester. I'd taken a break to have our first child and decided to bring my 2-month-old baby to a Friday afternoon research meeting. I set her down in her pumpkin seat and noticed a new face at the meeting. Oh, a new psychologist is presenting her dissertation research on children's motivation. This could be interesting, I thought. The new person had bought brownies for all of us to enjoy. Wow, that's a nice touch. And then she smiled and walked over to me and really seemed interested in me and my baby. Wow, feels good to have somebody make over my baby girl. Chris presented her research, and I was very impressed. This is one smart young woman. What a deep and insightful understanding of child development she possessed. At the end of her talk, rather than bask in the feedback about her research, she came straight up to me, this is so Chris, and offered to babysit anytime. She added that she and her partner, a developmental psychologist named Jim, would come to our home anytime we needed. They would babysit. 2 child psychologists, 1 tiny baby. Okay. Chris told me many times that she decided that day that we would be best friends. And when Chris puts her mind to something, the rest is history. A deep and enduring friendship developed for both Roger, that's Joanne's husband, and me with Chris and Jim. It's rare in life to have the gift of a foursome friendship where each person is nurtured and feels the same depth of love and connection. We're so grateful for that gift. From that day at the research meeting to the first night, I guess she did let you guys finally babysit their little girl. For 31 years, we've shared life's joys, sorrows, challenges, and all the in-between. Chris and I shared a strong commitment to healthy child development and spent hours talking about ways to foster that goal. She and Jim spent countless evenings at our home where we would talk about all that had happened in our week, about future plans, and savor being present together with stories, laughter, and occasionally tears. To say that Chris is a close friend is an understatement. In many ways, we were like sister friends who could be apart from each other, but once back in touch, time and distance disappeared. Interestingly, I felt closer to Chris most recently. We talked several times on the phone the weeks before she died. Joanne was so grateful for that. I told her about my friend Kathy, who's terminally ill with breast cancer. Chris was helpful to Kathy when she was first diagnosed and had spoken to her several times. As usual, Chris was supportive and compassionate, but I felt a little protective of Chris, not wanting her to worry that her own cancer might return. Chris said, she had no worries, that she felt so well and was looking forward to the wedding coming up and all the joy surrounding that event. Just the day before her death, we talked about how good she felt, like she had a new beginning in her life. We talked about the possibility of doing some joint professional presentations together. We talked about how proud she was that she was in recovery and working with her program, and how good she felt things were between her and Jim. And knowing it was important to me, and now to her, she told me that she had come to believe that there's a higher power. I told her that she'd come so far, and I felt closer to her than ever. We repeated that we loved each other several times and promised to talk again the next day. I know Chris's loving spirit is with all of us now, and with all of you, honoring her life. We're so grateful for the gift of Chris and Jim's friendship for so many years. Chris walked into my life on that day in October in 1981 at a research meeting, and little did I know how deeply she would touch our world. Our entire family is grateful for the loving imprint she's left on our lives. I love you, Chris. Joanne. I also just have a paragraph. I told you, everywhere she went, she picked up these wonderful women, and they just stuck with her and she with them. So this is from Holly Jobe, who was a very good friend of hers when they lived in Philadelphia, So when I first met Chris in the rooms in 1994, I was attracted by her articulate good humor and poise. As we got to know each other, we of course bonded over our love of cats. What I admired and most wanted to emulate about Chris was her kindness to everyone she met. She went out of her way to learn everyone's name and include them in her circle. And once you were in her circle, you were there forever. She was generous with her experience and expertise, even offering to assist one of my friends who was having trouble with her son. Her good-natured humor was delightful, and I can see those dimples as I think of her smile. Her humor really came out when I accompanied her to Knoxville to pick up Alice, a little munchkin of a kitten. Chris was recovering from chemo, and a new kitten was a good diversion. But there were only a few breeders in the country, so she decided to fly to Philadelphia, and I would accompany her to the kennel in Tennessee. It was truly an adventure up the holler, or a rather ramshackle establishment. We always felt that we had kind of rescued Alice. The funniest part was that the lovely country inn Chris found for us to stay. We wondered why everyone was so standoffish and didn't speak to us at dinner. And you remember that Chris can talk to anyone. With a little sleuthing, we found out that the place was run by a Christian minister who specialized in marriage counseling, and couples came for retreats to renew their relationships. Chris deduced that they thought we were lesbian. It's really hard for me to imagine not having Chris physically on the planet. I'm feeling the loss, knowing I can't pick up the phone and chat with her, even though her voice is still on our answering machine. The loss is another reminder how important it is to let the people we care about know we love them, and to clear up any misunderstandings. I'm blessed to know that there was nothing unsaid between us. Although I will miss talking with Chris and meeting up with her and Jim, she'll live in my heart, in the place where special people live, helping me to continue her legacy of kindness, generosity, and good humor. Adieu, my friend. I'm so blessed for having known you. I wish you only peace. I'm going to start doing voices in order to keep this. I have just one more and then my own. This is from a good friend of hers, Hilary Crevet. And Hilary, my heart goes out to her also. She had her suitcase by the door. She was ready to come from New York when the airport shut down and she couldn't get here. So she was very happy to be able to send just this little piece for me to read. We've known Chris and Jim for such a long time, almost 12 years. But in this gathering of friends and family, that makes us relative newcomers. Chris and Jim were the first joint friends that made us a couple, and they'll always be a pair in our minds. We met them in December 2000 on a scuba diving trip in Little Cayman. We were at the tail end of a rainy week, cooped up indoors with a very odd set of people. And Jim elaborated, psychiatrists, right? Okay, yeah, very odd. When, on the last day of our stay, Chris and Jim walked in. Maybe it was a coincidence, but it was the first sunny day of our trip. And a conversation over lunch launched the start of a great friendship. As it occasionally happens when you meet somebody on a vacation, we exchanged contact information, but never really expected to stay in touch. Wouldn't you know? Chris called a few weeks later. They were coming to New York, and we met for brunch, a wander around the city, an introduction to a favorite Mohegan artist, and the start of a long friendship. Islands and travel were always a part of our connection. We met in the Cayman Islands, vacationed together on Mohegan Island in Maine, got married on Block Island with Chris and Jim there for us, and got to visit them on their latest island, Orcas, and have wonderful times with them in Arizona, Philadelphia, New York, and in between. Everywhere we went with them, we met their wide circle of friends and were always welcomed into Chris and Jim's wonderful extended family. Over the last couple of weeks, we've spent a lot of time reminiscing about wonderful times with Chris, looking at pictures of our many adventures together, hearing her voice. We always seem to play rounds of phone tag, so we still get to listen to her voice on the answering machine. It's amazing how comforting that is, to still be able to hear her. Remembering her hugs. We've been laughing and crying at all the funny and quirky things we remember. Remember how she always had to get the last leaf out of the pool? She was the only synchronized swimmer we ever met. Her love of Cecil, Tyler, Alice, and her new babies. How we could just sit and talk or walk with her for hours and be happy together. In our minds, it will always be Chris and Jim, as they are an inseparable pair. Chris, we miss you and love you. And Jim, we miss you and love you and wish we could be there with you today. We're thinking of you and counting on seeing you soon. So this is the last one. So I'd just like to say a few words about what Chris and Jim have meant to our family, and I'm speaking for myself and my husband, Thomas, and our daughter, Leona. I find that Cristine is a very easy person to appreciate. We knew her as a treasured friend and a respected colleague. It was a joy to think back about all that Chris and Jim have done for our family, and just to share with you a few snapshots that I think reveal some of the things we loved about the beautiful and complex Cristine. I met Cristine for the first time a little over 30 years ago. It was 1981. I was a graduate student, and I was visiting UC Denver to interview for a postdoc with some bigwig professor. I have to tell you, it was all just a little touchy, because it turned out I was getting job interviews at all the same places that this bigwig professor's star student was getting job interviews. So a little worried. He's a brilliant guy. Jim Connell was his name. The bigwig said, "You should meet him, you're going to like him." I was like, "I don't know, this whole competition thing is sort of weirding me out." She thought I would really like him, and I would especially like his paramour, this Cristine Chandler person. And this paramour, she said, that's the real star of the program. Very mature, real head on her shoulders. She didn't actually say it. I'm not sure what she sees in this wild and crazy guy, but I think it was implied. So I was nervous about meeting Jim, but as you guys know, we'd never met a stranger. I was standing there so nervous, tapping my. He walked in with his arms out, gave me a giant hug. "Oh, yeah, your work is so great. We're going to have to be together at some point." I was, "Okay." Very exciting. He said, "Oh, but first you've got to meet this woman. You will adore this woman." And he said her name, Cristine. And he just started to glow. And I thought, wow, I've only known you for 5 seconds, and you are a goner, man. You are in love. And so Jim took me over to Cristine's house. And I have 2 mental snapshots from that. First I thought, as you walked in, you looked around and you went, okay, this is not the home of any graduate student I have ever met in my entire life. This is beautiful. This is sophisticated. You could aspire to this. And then I met Cristine. It was like, oh, of course, this is the perfect setting for this beautiful, sophisticated, never mind, this is exactly where this woman belongs. My second impression was that she also didn't act like any graduate student I knew. She was so self-possessed, so elegant, so everything. I thought, this woman could write a book of manners about how you should behave, like at every moment, in every situation. She could give lessons on grace and charm. And when I got to know her better, I thought, no, she really could write a book on manners, but it would be about the real meaning of courtesy, which is nothing about etiquette and all about caring for the comfort and the well-being of others. And Thomas and I got a chance to find out about Cristine's kindness firsthand. When we moved to Rochester, Jim actually made it so that we were able to work together. So we arrived from Berlin, and all of our worldly goods were trailing us in a container on a ship, and they weren't going to arrive for 6 weeks. So we just thought, we'll just live out of these suitcases for 2 weeks. And then the next snapshot I'd like to share with you is we're standing in Cristine's kitchen, and she's handing us thing after thing after thing of sheets and pillowcases and dishes and silverware, and you want a fan and a quilt, and it's just like she totally outfitted our whole entire house. And so we felt like we lived with them right from the very beginning. She did it without a second thought. And we felt very well taken care of, and we continue to feel that way because it turned out that in Rochester, the Chandler Connell household was the center of the social universe. And so every weekend there were dinner parties, celebrations. If you ever got anything good that happened to you, you knew you were going to have a glass of champagne at their house. And they included us effortlessly without any worries about reciprocity or formality. One of the things I loved about Cristine was that when you got there, she gave you something to do. So you didn't stand around feeling like a bump. And then she gave you something to do when you got there, and she gave you something to take with you when you left. And I have to say, I experienced it up close and personal when Thomas moved to Portland. I got pregnant. I was going to join him in December, but our landlord we couldn't get the lease. So suddenly I had 4 months where I needed to do someplace, and would it be in a hotel? What would it be? No. Next snapshot. This is me living in the Connell Chandler house. Okay. 4 months. And they did it so gracefully, so generously. It wasn't until people were looking at me afterwards going, "You imposed on them for 4 months? Wow, I never even really thought about it." And that's exactly the way they were. True elegance, true kindness. And Thomas and I are developmental psychologists, so I just want to end my remembrances with our admiration and our respect for Cristine's dedication, expertise in developmental and clinical psychology. She was really the star student. There can be more than one star in a universe. Both of you were stars. And her research on autonomous motivation, really trying to understand that in kids, it was a foundation for the measures we still use in our research today. And let me tell you, it predicts the heck out of everything. And her recent book on parenting, it really deserves to be a bestseller. Her true gift, I think, was as a clinician with infants and children. That line of work requires a combination of scientific knowledge as well as personal insight. And so my last snapshot, we came to visit them. They were staying at your house again. Our daughter was 4 months old, and when I got settled into their great room, Cristine was like, "Okay, give me that." And so I handed her over. Chris put one leg over, and she put the baby sort of in the crook of her leg and just sort of focused on her, and our daughter just went, "Zoop." It was like she just became totally mesmerized by Cristine's tone of voice and talking to her, and I just thought, she's got that gift of making that connection. And then after about 15, she was doing all kinds of things with her, of course. And then after about 15 minutes, she sort of nods, she looks up to me, and she goes, "Very good. She's fully baked." Great. Those are a few of our snapshots. Chris and Jim and Chris, treasured colleagues, dear friends. You brought us back to America. You fed and cared us in every way that matters. You changed our lives forever. We thank you, and we love you. Do you want me to read the poem? The Dash? Okay. This was a poem sent by one of her friends. It's called The Dash by Linda Ellis. I read of a reverend who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on her tombstone, from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of her birth, and spoke of the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time that she spent alive on earth, and now only those who loved her knew what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love, and how we spend our dash. So thinking about this long and hard, are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that can still be rearranged. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real, and always try to understand the way other people feel, and be less quick to anger, and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect, and more often wear a smile, remembering that this special dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy is being read, with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say about how you spent your dash?
Now we'll have a little bit of music by Deborah and Monique.
Our encounter with Chris was brief and very joyous. Deborah and I just a few months ago performed a salon concert at their home, and she was so gracious and welcoming, and her two little cats sat on a little crate and listened to us rehearse this very piece, very joyous piece. And so we'd like to play for you the second movement of Mozart's G major sonata for violin and piano.
DeBoer will be speaking now.
I stand here to celebrate Cristine's courage. I've known Chris only a few years here on Orcas, as Jim and Chris became friends of Helen and me during many walks on Sunday morning around Mountain Lake. These were tough times for Chris. Attacked by cancer and troubled by recalcitrant shoulders, she went through a seemingly endless series of operations. Yet I never got the impression that she thought of herself as a victim. Things were to be gotten through, and she got through them at great personal cost. On top of all of this, Chris took on the job of president of our homeowners association, a job that usually comes with a modicum of stress. But these were not ordinary times for our association. The previous president had gotten the association involved in a court case fight with a pugnacious neighbor over payment of road use fees, about $600 a year. By the time I became aware of this lawsuit, the pugnacious neighbor had spent about $100,000 on that suit and threatened to ruin our homeowners association. But Chris was undeterred. I went to the court session in which she had to testify and be questioned by opposing counsel, and came away astonished and impressed by how, with all her other troubles besetting her, Chris calmly and precisely testified and responded to everything thrown at her. What a courageous woman.
Maureen Barnett will speak now.
Well, listening to these stories, I realize that I'm one of those very fortunate women to have been drawn into Chris's life. I only knew her for a couple of years. Close friendships, like marriage, you get to experience the beautiful and the ugly. My friendship with Chris was like that. Challenging, sweet, frustrating, comforting, poignant, and intimate. I met Chris at a very difficult time in her life. She was struggling both mentally and physically, as were those who were close to her. It was a little like watching a person swing from a frail rope on a cliffside, only to be pulled up and rescued at the last moment, not once, but many times. But I always believed the deepest part of her wanted to be healthy. To live life awake and alive and aware. I first wanted to be friends with her to help her get healthy. But I was also drawn to her elegant and gentle spirit. I needed that. Our friendship blossomed into so much more. One night after we had known each other a few months, we went to dinner. She wanted to tell me some things that she was afraid to talk about, some of her deepest, darkest secrets. Over a Caesar salad that she hardly touched, she told me these things, almost whispering. I listened. She told me what she told me was deep and dark, but no deeper or darker than any of us carry. When she finished, there was a long silence, except for my chewing. I wanted her to continue. I waited for her to continue. She waited for me to react. The silence continued. When I looked up, the look on her face was one of shock, outrage, relief, and disbelief. I have never seen so many emotions cross a person's face in such a short time. "Are you still my friend?" she whispered. This from such an accomplished psychologist. She always said, "I'm a scientist, very, very left-brained, not artistic." Well, anyone who's been to her house knows differently. When she returned from treatment, she had started to create stained glass color designs, drawing other women into a group to create art every day. I love to draw and color myself, so one afternoon we went to Enzo's, pulled 2 tables together and colored away for 2 hours, talking quietly and helping each other select colors for various shapes. The artistic side of herself, which was always there, had finally emerged, and she accepted it in a new way. These past months, we were able to garden together almost daily. She had the vision. She selected the flowers and colors, and I arranged them in pots around her deck. During that time, we had such wonderful talks. The last one about family was particularly rich. Only 2 weeks before she died, we found that our beloved Airedale was dying of cancer. We had been in the vet an hour earlier to hear the shocking news, and we were absolutely devastated. We pulled up in the ferry line, tears still streaming down our faces, unable to face anyone, when Chris pulled up right behind us in line. She got out of her car, she came over to us and knew instantly that we were in trouble. She just hugged us so gently, so lovingly, so strongly. Everything she had ever learned from her reading, her schooling, her life experiences felt like it was there, present in that hug. She was absolutely the best person, and probably the only person that we could have seen in that moment. We can never know what it is like to live in someone else's body, experience someone else's life. We can never know how much physical and emotional pain she had over the course of her life. But I always had the sense that no matter how much pain she was in, she refused to let go of that rope. The past 8 months, she climbed to the summit. She became the whole, healthier person that she wanted to be, that she had the potential to be. She left us when she was most at peace with her past, her family, herself, mentally and physically. And that's what we get for being human. The whole spectrum of life's struggles and joys. Chris was truly human, and I am blessed to have experienced the full range of her humanity.
So I met Chris at an Orcas Island Community Foundation lunch. She, of course, was generously giving to the community. This was about 18 months ago. And I had the great luck of sitting next to her. So we began to talk, as psychologists will, comparing theories, comparing orientations, comparing research. And I thought, oh my God, this woman is so friggin' smart. Brilliant woman. She asked for my card. Sure. I thought maybe she'd want to have lunch. That was Chris number one. She wanted to see me in therapy. And I have gotten permission from Jim, and I believe Chris would want me to share that information with you. Because Chris was always one who wanted to bring people inspiration and hope. So Chris came into therapy with me in February of 2011. She at the time was struggling with addiction, struggling with pain, struggling with history. She began by telling stories of her childhood, her brilliant but distant father, her troubled mother, and how she was always getting into trouble as a kid. She would always climb trees, and she'd fall out of them. And then she'd go climb them again, and she'd fall out of them. She talked about Nancy, her dear, dear older sister, who she considered her protector. She remembered a story of Nancy when Chris was 2 and Nancy was older, saving her from a gigantic dog that was preparing to devour her, of course. This is why she didn't have dogs, she had cats. And Nancy always making sure that she was out of her mother's way when mother got a little angry. Chris herself didn't allow herself to get angry. She kept it in and really sublimated it through reading. And she told me she had read all the classics by the age of 14, including the Russians, she said proudly. I was blown away, and I was terrified of how smart she was. Was I going to be able to help this woman? Who knows? So she admitted to alcoholism, but not to pain med addiction, until one day she did. She allowed me to find her inpatient care. She finally began to work hard, and she was blessed by wonderful, wonderful therapists at her treatment facility. Once she admitted her dependency on medication, especially for pain, out came her courage and her humility. Before that, early in her recovery, she'd offer little tidbits of psychology to others because she thought they were fascinating. She was hiding. Those were her good smokescreen. And because she knew so friggin' much, she could talk a lot of psychology for a long time. But then she learned that she didn't have to try so hard. All she had to do was speak the truth. In her treatment center, just like Ellen was describing, she was surrounded by a community of women. She was a magnet for women who allowed her simply to be. She began to wonder, this was part of her journey. She'd been in 3 car accidents. In all of them, she should have died. She didn't. She'd suffered serious cancer that could have killed her. It didn't. She began to question the notion of a higher power. Perhaps there was one. And then one of her wonderful counselors gave her a branch to hang on to. This counselor said, "Perhaps a higher power is the collective wisdom of those who have searched before you." That she could believe with her whole heart. She also knew by then that she didn't have all the resources inside herself to get well, despite her prodigious knowledge, her 2 PhDs. She clung to that branch as the addiction tried to wash her downstream. it held. She learned to not talk unless it was needed. She talked more at meetings and less outside. She learned to soothe herself within, no matter where she was. She learned to embrace her flaws and not hide them. She learned to face down monstrous addiction, not with self-aggrandizement, but instead with utter humility. In her last month of treatment, as Maureen was saying, she rediscovered her creativity working on coloring books with magic markers, creating stained glass masterpieces, and typical of Chris, not only did she draw people to her here with her coloring, but all kinds of women at the treatment center found themselves sitting at a table with her coloring. She had that kind of power, like a magnet. She learned to love again, and that love could embrace every emotion, the pain, the anger, and the fear of complete surrender. In her last 3 months, she and Jim once again fell in love. She spoke of the treasure that was their union, the profound respect, admiration, laughter, and deep connection they had shared always. Her love for her surrogate children, both the human kind and the feline kind. And her wish to give back to this sacred community that had supported her here and given so deeply to her. And so she leaves us all, moved by her courage, touched by her ability to resurrect herself, and with a deeper faith that we too can grow. The memory of Chris can now serve as our branch of the tree.
This is the only job they gave me. If we could all look at our remembrance cards, and on the back of that card is a prayer. And this is a prayer that Chris read to me about 4 months ago when she was in her final treatment at Hazel. And I said, Chris, you're showing me up for not having read our big book very carefully. I didn't see that in the big book. She said it didn't come from the big book. I saw it was one of the Hazelton meditations or one of those. She said no. I said, well, where did it come from? She said, I wrote it. I won't use the 2 words that I said to her. One starts with B and the other starts with S, because we can say I said, no, I'm not kidding. I really wrote this. I really did. And I said, well, it must have taken you. As those of you who know her, and those of you who love her know, she was not a woman of few words. She had a professional writer take her book from 1,000 pages to 140. And she wasn't a poet on the surface, but obviously underneath that she was. She said, I wrote this in 5 minutes. It was a first draft. So, as others have shared before, the discovery of a higher power for Chris was late in her life, but just in time. And this is Chris's 3rd step prayer, and I ask that we read this together, because I'm not going to get through it. So I need some backup. And start with, may silence be bestowed upon me, that I may listen more. May quiet be bestowed upon me, that I may seek to hear. May yielding be bestowed upon me, that I may more softly go. May willingness be bestowed upon me, that I may feel it all. May openness be bestowed upon me, that I may see the light. May understanding be bestowed upon me, that I may shed self-will. May acceptance be bestowed upon me, that I may see new faith. may surrender be bestowed upon me.
Okay, this is what Chris would have loved. Could each of you who are comfortable doing so turn to a neighbor next to you and just simply share, if you wish, a reflection of Chris, a story of Chris, a memory of Chris. We'll just take a few minutes for this, but Chris would have loved that, for each of you to connect with each other. Just turn to a neighbor now. If you wish for silence, that's okay too.
And we have the little sheets and we get it in little tabs and we go and unfold them. And we get all dressed up in our tuxedos and our long dresses.
Yeah, you're supposed to be smart. And you're supposed to know you're smart.
You.
Yes.
You and I need to go on the road together. What a great speaker.
What? Yeah. You remember all the things I wrote down? I didn't get to those. Yes. I know.
Yeah, wow. That's great.
You take great care of that car.
I do, don't I? Yeah.
I thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Absolutely. Yeah.
And your music at the beginning sets such a beautiful tone in it.
He wrote that song.
You really?
Yeah. I meant to mention it, but it felt a little uncomfortable with it.
I mean, this whole thing is reminding me how brilliant they both are. It's like,
oh.
You know, I take it for granted that I'm their brother. You know, and I treat them like a brother, but it's like I forget.
But you know, I'd go up there and I'd be cold and I'd be on my motorcycle.
What's your name?
Thank you, those of you who participated. Thank you very much. Here's what we would like to do next. We want to invite anybody in our group who would like to come up and share a story, share a memory, to speak a few words just for a couple of minutes each. We wanted to give you the opportunity to speak about Chris if you wished. Is anyone wanting to come forward?
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Heisinger. I had the privilege and honor of working with Chris professionally as a physical therapist, and I can speak to Carl's description of Chris as being courageous, and she showed that in spades whenever she came in. What I had to do with her was not fun, and it hurt. And she would come in with grace, with dignity. We had fabulous conversations. We talked about any and all concepts of what we wanted to chit-chat about, what was going on in the world, what the deck furniture was going to do, what her kitty cat was doing, her book, and then she found out I had kids. Well, how old are they? What are they doing? Do they like to read? What books do they like to read? She just kept going on all the while, and occasionally with a tear streaming down her face as I'm stretching out her shoulder and her arm. She lived with grace. She showed courage time and time again. And I mentioned to Jim when I saw her for the last time in July, she had that spark back. She was the Chris that I knew that she was. She had that great joy of life. And in my heart I felt, there's the Chris that, for all of you who might have known her fleetingly, this was the Chris that you should know, because she was back. So, thank you.
Anyone else? Please.
Can I do it from here?
Of course. Which? Can you wait just one moment? We'd love to have your words.
You can leave that up there, and they can pass this around.
Well, there you are.
Okay. I'm Betsy Nelson. My husband is Jim, and Jim and Chris. My Jim and Chris met a long time ago. But once they moved here, we became friends. And after Chris had been having some of her treatments, and it was in the spring, and they were having the garden club tour, we met at Youngren's to look at things. And then we were going on to the next place, and I was following them out in my car, and they were in their new convertible. And it's a beautiful day, and they're driving down the road ahead of me, and all of a sudden I see Chris reach up to the sky and drive down the road on this beautiful sunny day with her arms up, embracing the world that was there and the joy in the moment.
That's great.
Jim wants you to know that he was driving. It's okay. Okay. Anyone else? Would you like to come up?
My name is Phước Wang. Jim, when he first called, actually asked me if I would share about a part of the life that really involved the transition between Philadelphia and Orcas. I had the privilege of designing the house with them on top of Mount Buck. And I think that story really starts from when Chris first came to the West Coast. I presume was to Western Washington University to do her master's. And she tells the story of settling into her new abode. And the very first morning that she was there, she went to the bathroom, looked out the window up high, and there in its majestic splendor was Mount Baker. And then she went on to I think spend some years getting to know the back roads and trails and the forests of the northwest coast quite well. I think ultimately that played a large role in her wanting to come back to the northwest with Jim, and they invested in a little property at the bottom of Mount Buck a few decades back, and that kind of morphed into a little property on top of Mount Buck. That's a different story. The house is probably the first one I've ever done with cat toilets. There are two of them, one on each floor, and they're wood paneled. But I challenge you to look for them if you ever go up there, and they worked. It was. I think one of the most striking things about Chris was, aside from a smile, was that she was always fully engaged. She engaged fully, and she engaged thoughtfully through sort of the better times and sort of the less good times. But she was always totally engaged and always caring. So Chris, I'm glad Chris recognized that there is a higher power, and I think the higher power is God, and God has told Chris that her work on earth is done, she's done well, and it's time to have a good rest. So.
Okay, we'll now close with some music by Martin and Jean.
Mm-hmm.